All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 6, Section 3, The War in the South. So just to recap real quickly, 6.2, so we're in the midst of the American Revolution, that there was a key turning point at the Battle of Saratoga, and that was when France, or French support, came in on the colonial side. Now, initially, the British had targeted the middle colonies, that is to attack New York and Pennsylvania, which they actually had quite a bit of success in doing. The belief by the British side was that if you cut off the head, which was in their eyes Massachusetts, the rest of the revolutionary movement would essentially die out. That turned out not to be the case, and the war continued to drag on and on and on year after year after year. The British changed their strategy, and that was to focus in the southern colonies, beginning with Georgia and South Carolina. They believed that they could garner more loyalist support in the southern colonies from a couple of different constituencies. The rural population was potentially one of them. You had rural colonies, or rural colonists, I should say, had conflicts historically with the colonial government. Would those rural colonists seeking to maybe redress some of their grievances against colonial governments side with the British? It was a possibility. You had many more slaves in the southern colonies, which again recalled Dunmore's proclamation. Although there were some slaves that did get their freedom from fighting on the colonial side, there were far more who got their freedom from siding from the British side, and potentially the Native Americans in the South who had clashed with these colonial governments. So what essentially all these groups have in common was that they had conflicts with the colonial governments. And for that reason, remember, it's the colonial governments that are declaring independence. For that reason, could they potentially side with the British? And that's essentially what the British are hoping. The British do get success, or have success, in capturing Savannah, Georgia. So once again, when it comes to the military engagements, the British oftentimes are victorious. They also capture Charleston, South Carolina, which is this picture here, or this map is showing you Charleston, South Carolina. So both the capitals of Georgia and South Carolina fall into the hands of the British. They also changed their strategy slightly in enlisting colonists in the British Army. Typically before this point, the British had only used soldiers from England. In the South, after enlisting the colonists, you essentially have battles in which it's colonists versus colonists, or a civil war, potentially. I mean, these are loyalists fighting patriots, right? Colonists versus colonists. Charles Cornwallis is the British general in charge of this effort. Now, initially, the British have success in capturing these cities, but it's really the colonial refusal to engage the British Army head-on that allows for this revolutionary movement to continue to thrive. General Cornwallis attempts to essentially hunt down the what essentially makes up the colonial army in the South. Doesn't really have a lot of success in doing so, but goes throughout the South unopposed. He eventually makes his way to Virginia, which is where Yorktown is located. And General Cornwallis is awaiting supplies. L-I-E-S. Awaiting supplies in Yorktown, Virginia, when both American and French forces attack. This is American forces by land, led by George Washington, who really had spent most of the army just trying not to get captured, and French forces by sea. It's the French Navy. And by blockading Cornwallis by land with Washington, and by blockading his escape by sea with the French Navy, the United States, or the 13 colonies, are successful in getting Cornwallis to surrender. And this siege of Yorktown, or Battle of Yorktown, not just as a colonial victory, but also is the last battle of the Revolution. When Cornwallis and his men surrender at Yorktown to Washington, and this is the image here, the British surrender, Washington right here. When the British surrender here at Yorktown, it sparks off a sort of crisis back at home in Great Britain, and more or less the British Parliament and the public opinion decides that this is no longer a war worth pursuing, and they eventually sue for peace. The peace treaty that is signed at the end of the American Revolution is the Treaty of Paris. Among those that are there, people like Benjamin Franklin. Maybe the most important part was a British recognition of independence. And so this idea that when the Declaration of Independence was signed, it had put forward the idea that if the war was won, then independence was achieved. The fact that British was willing to not just, admit defeat, but also recognize that the United States was now an independent country was a big deal politically. It also meant that the United States got a lot of British territory, more or less everything up to the Mississippi River now belonged to the United States. So this was territory that previously didn't belong to the colonies. And what the British got was that the colonists should not persecute any loyalists. And so by getting a recognition of independence and by getting all this land, the colonists are now what we call the United States, agreed that they would not persecute those who were loyal to the British side.